Hello, welcome back to Simon's Rants. I'm Simon, and today we're going to count down the top 101 movies of all time. Making a list like this is impossible. There's no way you can make a perfect list that everybody's going to like. But I've spent the past 8 months trying to watch all of the greatest films of all time to make this list. I've watched a lot of really good movies, guys. I've done my best, so please like and share, and if you're new here, subscribe. And I know you probably disagree with the list a little bit, so go ahead and leave your list in the comments below and we can talk about it there. Because honestly, there's thousands of movies that could have made this list, so let me know which ones you think I missed. Also, I worked really hard on the top 10 lists for each decade, so make sure to check those out too. They are a little bit different because not every movie that made those lists is actually in this list. And some decades were just so good that not every great film could fit into the top 10. But that's enough for me. Let's get on with this list. The Court Jester is a 1955 film directed by Melvin Frank and starring Danny Kaye. A hapless carnival performer masquerades as the Court Jester as part of a plot against an evil ruler who has overthrown the rightful king. It's a semi-Robin Hood parody that's hilarious, but also just a lot of fun. Danny Kaye is always great, but this might honestly be the best performance of his career. He's funny, he's lovable, and he's extremely believable as this awkward side character that's thrust into the lead role. He's just a lot of fun to watch, and this movie's great because of it. Ernest and Celestine is a 2012 film directed by Stéphane Aubier starring Forest Whitaker and Mackenzie Foy. In a world where bears and mice are mortal enemies, an unlikely friendship forms between a small mouse named Celestine and a bear named Ernest. This movie is cute, it's sweet, and it has some of the most beautiful minimalistic animation I've ever seen. But it's not just simply for kids, it also has a social and political commentary that's blunt but not forced. It would be easy to make this heavy-handed, but they did it really well. And like I said, the animation is beautiful, it's hand-drawn, minimalistic, and just perfect. It might honestly be my favorite animation I've ever seen. Duck Soup is a 1933 film directed by Leo McCarey and starring the Marx Brothers. I would go over the plot, but the plot in Marx Brothers movies literally doesn't matter at all after the first 15 minutes. What makes the Marx Brothers so great is their dynamic comedy that's so different from brother to brother but works together so well. They're each hilarious on their own, but together they're even better. They're just great. You've got Harpo with his physical comedy and mime style, then you've got Chico with his wordplay, and then there's Groucho doing his stand-up bits. Put them all together and it doesn't matter what the plot is, they're just hilarious, and this is one of the best movies that they made. I honestly don't know the plot to any of the movies they made. I've watched them all and I don't know the plots. But honestly, I don't mind. I love this movie even though I don't necessarily even remember what it's about. This movie is just that funny. Singing in the Rain is a 1952 film directed by Stanley Donen starring Gene Kelly, Donald O'Connor, and Debbie Reynolds. The plot of the film follows a silent film production company and cast as they attempt to make the difficult transition into sound film. And this honestly might be the most iconic musical of all time. The songs are all great, the dance numbers are fantastic. Of course, everybody knows about the song Singing in the Rain, but you cannot do this movie full justice without talking about this dancing. Donald O'Connor is actually credited with creating hip-hop in this movie. It's fantastic. The dancing's just amazing. The character chemistry is great, they're all lovable, and this movie's just so much fun to watch. The Testament of Dr. Mabuse is a 1933 film written and directed by Fritz Lang starring Rudolf Klein-Rogge. The plot of this film falls directly after its predecessor, Dr. Mabuse the Gambler. While although Dr. Mabuse is incarcerated, crimes continue on in an eerily similar way to what he was doing. Fritz Lang is one of the greatest directors of all time, and he's even better in this than he was in the first one. He's better as a director, the editing is better, the script is more concise, his control over the scene and all the actors is just amazing. Fritz Lang might actually be the best director of all time despite not many people knowing who he is anymore. If you haven't seen this movie, you should check it out. It is great. The Grand Budapest Hotel is a 2014 film written and directed by Wes Anderson, starring Tony Revolori and Ralph Fiennes. The plot follows a legendary concierge of a famous hotel and the lobby boy who becomes his most trusted friend. There's theft, romance, intrigue, murder, and plenty of Wes Anderson isms. As is to be expected from a Wes Anderson film, it's quick-witted, hilarious, and extremely fun to look at. The scenery and the camera work is so pristine and perfect looking, the acting and the comedy is all great. Everything he makes is just so much fun to look at. He could honestly probably make a film about paint drying and it would be entertaining. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a 2010 film written and directed by Edgar Wright, starring Michael Cera and Mary Elizabeth Winstead. The plot of the film follows a guy who meets and falls in love with the literal girl of his dreams but must fight off her 7 evil exes in order to be with her. This film serves as a parody for video games, romance movies, comic books, and is just one of the funniest movies ever made. And on top of it being hilarious and well acted and well written, it's also extremely beautiful to look at. Edgar Wright's cinematography and editing style is brilliant. He might be the most underrated director of this generation. He's amazing. Life of Pi is a 2012 film directed by Ang Lee. It's about a teenage boy being stranded in the middle of the ocean in a lifeboat with nothing but water and animals around him. It's one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen. I'm always critical of CGI, but the CGI and the visuals in this movie are breathtaking and astounding no matter how large or small the screen is. You could be watching this on your phone and still just be amazed. But it doesn't just take great visuals to make a movie, it takes a great story too, and this one has that. Is it a fantasy? Is it an allegory? Is it a tragedy? Is it all of the above? Probably. But whatever it is amazing and I adore this movie. Toy Story 2 is a 1999 film written and directed by John Lasseter, starring Tom Hanks and Tim Allen. The plot of the film follows Woody as he's stolen to be a part of a museum exhibit. The rest of the toys must adventure across the entire city to try to find him and rescue him. The sequel is honestly better than the first one in every way. I know that's a bit of an unpopular opinion, but just look at it. The story has expanded from a backyard all the way to an entire city. The characters have developed from the first one, and we have new and great characters added as well. The plot is just bigger and better. The animation is 10 times better. This movie is an improvement in every way. It also has one of the best original soundtracks of all time, culminating in one of the most emotional kid movie moments ever. If you say you didn't cry during that as a kid, you're lying. I know this is kind of cheating to include the whole trilogy, but it honestly just feels like one long movie with intermissions in between. It was all filmed at the same time, just released in 3 parts, so it kind of is. But regardless, it was directed by Peter Jackson and starring Elijah Wood, Viggo Mortensen, Orlando Bloom, a lot of people. Ian McKellen, Sean Bean, Sean Astin, Andy Serkis, can't forget Andy Serkis. So many great performances in this movie. And fantasy as a whole gets kind of a bad rep because it's often cheesy, it's fantastical, it's fun, it's not usually deep or complex in any way, it's just, ooh, fun fantasy. But Lord of the Rings honestly made fantasy cool to a lot of people. It had finally taken fantasy and put it on an epic scale that it had never been done before, but it had always intended to be. It was big, it was epic, and it was amazing with amazing acting and amazing imagery and such good CGI for the time with Gollum. This movie was groundbreaking in every way and deserves a spot on this list. The Illusionist is a 2006 film written and directed by Neil Burger. It's starring Ed Norton, Jessica Biel, Paul Giamatti, and Rufus Sewell, and it's just phenomenal acting across the board. Especially Paul Giamatti in this movie is just so much fun. Paul Giamatti could have chemistry with a rock. He could just be sitting and talking to a rock for 2 hours and I would watch and enjoy that movie. But on top of that, the writing for this movie is just extremely clever and I enjoy the plot, I enjoy the characters. This movie is just intelligent fun that you can watch over and over and over again without understanding everything in this movie. You might still miss little pieces here and there because it's just that well written. The Usual Suspects is a 1995 film directed by Bryan Singer and starring Kevin Spacey. Police investigating the explosion of a boat find 27 dead bodies and $91 million in dirty money. The rabbit hole goes much deeper than initially expected though, as the events seem to be connected somehow to the crime lord Kaiser Sose. And this movie works so well for 2 main reasons. The character chemistry between the 5 lead criminals is amazing, they're just so much fun to watch. And then the second point is the bombshell ending. It's one of the most iconic, best endings in movie history. The Departed is a 2006 film directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Matt Damon, Mark Wahlberg, and Jack Nicholson. And the acting between DiCaprio and Damon and Nicholson is so good that I can actually forgive Mark Wahlberg for being in this movie. It's also another extremely clever plot that's just so much fun to watch all the way until the end because you don't know what's gonna happen. This was the perfect film for Scorsese to direct. It's subtle, it's nuanced, it's got great characters and great acting, and I just enjoyed pretty much every moment of this movie. Bronson is a 2008 film directed by Nicholas Winding Refn starring Tom Hardy in the best performance of his career. The movie is a true life story about the most dangerous prisoner in UK history. He's a deadly criminal who enjoys hurting people for no particular reason and enjoys being in prison because of it. He enjoys getting into fights with guards and other prisoners and murdering people in an artistic way. Refn and Hardy did not take the easy way out of this film by just making it some action movie about a guy beating up a bunch of people in prison. This is an artistic and nuanced interpretation of the psychology of this insane psychopath. The complete unhinging of this sociopath who truly doesn't want anything out of life. He's not trying to get a reward. He's not trying to reach a goal. He's just doing what he wants to do because nothing matters. This is nihilism in its full artistic glory, and it is a brilliant experience. Moonrise Kingdom is a 2012 film written and directed by Wes Anderson. The plot follows two middle school lovers as they run away to be together. And in traditional Wes Anderson style, it's very funny, very quirky, and just a lot of fun to look at. It's got great acting from the kids, but also from Ed Norton, Bruce Willis, Bill Murray. But above all that, it perfectly captures the spirit of being a middle schooler. If I had seen this as a middle schooler, it would have been my favorite movie of all time. I love the feel of this movie. I love the passion of this movie. It's just so much fun, so funny, and just great to look at. A Shot in the Dark is a 1964 film written and directed by Blake Edwards and starring Peter Sellers. This is the first sequel in the Pink Panther franchise and the best of the series. It took the best part of the predecessor, that being Inspector Clouseau, and made him the focal point of this film and all the films moving forward. And this was not only a great comedy, but it was actually a really well-written murder mystery as well. This is the perfect balance of mystery and comedy, whereas the first one didn't focus on Clouseau enough and the other ones were just a little too comedy-based. This one is just great. The music, the cinematography, and the acting, and Peter Sellers is all just fantastic. This movie is awesome. The Lion King is a 1994 film directed by Roger Allers, starring Matthew Broderick, James Earl Jones, and Jeremy Irons. After the king is betrayed and murdered by his brother, his son and heir to the throne is exiled. He must then decide who he really is and whether it's up to him or not to fulfill his destiny. Oh, and by the way, it's a Disney movie about talking animals. But that doesn't stop it from being serious and a great movie. It's got great acting, it's got great animation, and the music by Elton John and Tim Rice is absolutely amazing. This movie as a whole is great, but the music might honestly be the best part about it. And that's saying a lot because I believe that The Lion King is the greatest kids movie ever made. Black Swan is a 2010 film directed by Darren Aronofsky with a great cast of Natalie Portman, Mila Kunis, and Winona Ryder. It's like a psychological thriller about the stress that the mind and the body goes under being a prima ballerina. All the competition, the backstabbing, the abuse that these people go through, it's crazy. It's already a dark subject matter, but then you throw in some twisted Aronofsky imagery and this movie is amazing. I'm also very critical of dancing in movies, and the dancing in this is actually pretty good. The acting, the writing, the directing all came together amazingly well to make a great film. The Wizard of Oz is a 1939 film directed by Victor Fleming and starring Judy Garland. The plot of the film follows a girl as she's swept away to a magical wonderland named Oz. From there she tries to get back home to Kansas but must complete several tasks in order to do so. And I don't think this movie needs much of an introduction. Everybody knows it because it's simply iconic. It had groundbreaking special effects and has probably the most famous musical song ever. Everybody knows Over the Rainbow. Like, you have to know that song. It's not an option. The set designs are amazing and the costumes are out of this world, and so much about this movie is just breathtaking. I can't even imagine what it would have been like to see this in theaters when it came out. It must have been amazing. From a technical standpoint, this was so far ahead of anything that would come out for years. You could watch this with movies from the mid to late 50s and it wouldn't stand out as odd or different. It's that far ahead of its time. Blazing Saddles is a 1974 film written and directed by Mel Brooks, starring Cleavon Little and Gene Wilder. A corrupt politician attempts to vacate a small town by appointing a black sheriff. However, that quickly backfires as the sheriff leads a charge against him. This film broke so many boundaries and crossed so many lines that it's so great for it. This is one of the greatest comedies of all time. It's quick-witted, it's hilarious, it's clever. The writing by Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder is absolutely amazing, and Cleavon Little is a great leading man, and then it's also got great cast around him. This is just undeniably one of the funniest movies ever made. It's great. The Seven Seals is a 1957 film written and directed by Ingmar Bergman and starring Max von Sydow. The plot follows a knight as he returns home from the Crusades with more questions than answers. He takes on a gamble with death in order to try to prolong his life so he can answer these questions that he has. It's filled with great dark imagery, the acting's good, the cinematography's good, the writing's flawless. This movie is so interesting and so original, and there's nothing I've ever seen quite like it. Long after the movie's already over, you'll be thinking about the philosophy and the theology and questioning what it all means. This movie was designed to try to make you think, and it exceeds at that perfectly. This movie is just fantastic. Life of Brian is a 1979 film written and directed by Monty Python and starring Monty Python. Born not too far away from and on the same night as Jesus, Brian of Nazareth finds himself often mistaken for and caught up in the problems of the Messiah. I really don't know what else I'm supposed to say about this movie. It's just amazing in every way. It's one of the greatest comedies ever made for obvious reasons. It's just so good. Just watch it if you haven't, and if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. Nosferatu is a 1922 film directed by F.W. Murnau starring Max Schreck. This is the original vampire film taking its main inspiration from Bram Stoker's Dracula novel. It's eerie, it's creepy, and it's got amazing dark imagery that's so fun to look at. The imagery in this movie is simply iconic and has defined so many things that we know in our vampire movies even now. It's one of the earliest horror movies of all time and is still great to this day. Touch of Evil is a 1958 film written and directed by Orson Welles, starring Orson Welles, Charlton Heston, and Janet Leigh. The plot follows a murder mystery, kidnapping, and a police corruption story all happening in a small Mexican border town. And Orson Welles as a director in this is just completely technically masterful. The directing, the acting, the dialogue, it's all so well put together. From the first scene on, which is one of the most, if not the most iconic opening scenes of all time, this movie just holds your attention perfectly. Although not Orson Welles' best movie, it might be his most technically perfect. It's a close second if not. This movie is just amazing. The King of Comedy is a 1982 film directed by Martin Scorsese starring Robert De Niro and Jerry Lewis. The plot follows a crazed fan of a famous comedian and talk show host as he tracks him down, stalks him, and even eventually kidnaps him to try to help his own career. He believes that he is just as funny and can be an even better comedian if just given the chance. The crazed fan is played by De Niro in one of the best performances of his career, and the comedian by Jerry Lewis, who is absolutely phenomenal. This honestly might be my favorite Scorsese film. It's extremely underrated. It might not be as polished as some of his later films, but it's extremely unique and original, and I love it. It's a great story being acted out by great actors, being directed by a great director. What more could you want from a film? Back to the Future is a 1985 film written and directed by Robert Zemeckis starring Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd. The plot follows a high school kid who accidentally goes back in time and stops his parents from meeting. He must now get them back together before he goes back to the future. Or back to the present, but that doesn't sound as good. And he has to fix it quick or he and his entire family will cease to exist. This movie is pinnacle 80s cheese and it's lovely and perfect in every way. Obviously there's gonna be plot holes, obviously there's gonna be cheesy moments. It's a 1980s sci-fi comedy. What more can you expect? It's not highbrow. But it's so much fun, all the characters are great and all the actors have great chemistry. It's just a lot of fun to watch. Dead Poets Society is a 1989 film directed by Peter Weir starring Robin Williams. And if you know anything about Robin Williams and his dramas, you're gonna cry. The plot follows a teacher at a boarding school who's trying to help the students understand a new perspective on poetry and literature. Not just reading the words, but understanding the beauty and the romance behind them. He challenges the students on a personal level and helps them to grow in ways that they had never thought they could before. Robin Williams is fantastic in this, and so are the students for that matter. A few of them actually got famous from this, including Robert Sean Leonard and Ethan Hawke. This movie is heartbreaking, it's profound, and it's poignant, and man is it hard to watch, but it's definitely worth it. Forrest Gump is a 1994 film directed by Robert Zemeckis and starring Tom Hanks. The events of American history are told from the perspective of a man with an IQ of 75. And despite his simpleness, he's actually rather heroic and a great leader. The film is funny, sweet, and rather poignant. The movie could have easily have fallen apart if not for the great performance by Tom Hanks. His performance is powerful and emotional, which keeps the film from becoming sappy and silly. This is honestly probably Tom Hanks' best performance of his career. The acting in general is great and the dialogue is also good, making it feel all the more real, which makes it more relatable. Adding great directing by Zemeckis, and this is just simply one of the best dramas ever made. Sunset Boulevard is a 1950 film directed by Billy Wilder starring William Holden and Gloria Swanson. The plot of the film follows a screenwriter who accidentally gets involved with an older actress. Ultimately, this is a film about what lengths people are willing to go to just to feed their own delusionment. This film was far ahead of its time in how it represented the behind the scenes of Hollywood and how dark and sinister it really is. It has great acting, great directing, great writing, and ultimately a really great story that's inspired many movies since. The Man Who Laughs is a 1928 film directed by Paul Lenny, starring Conrad Veidt and Mary Philbin. The plot follows a man who is cruelly disfigured by King James. He has a hideous smile cut into his face that he must live with for the rest of his life. Because of this, he must stoop to becoming a clown despite secretly having noble blood. This movie toes the line perfectly between horror and tragedy, and has inspired so many great films like Frankenstein to do the same thing. And the lead character's iconic look was the main inspiration for DC Comics' Joker. This film might not be well remembered now, but all of the iconic things that it inspired are. The Godfather is a 1972 film directed by Francis Ford Coppola starring Marlon Brando and Al Pacino. And this is one of the quintessential gangster movies. It follows a Corleone gangster family in their rise and fall and rebirth as a gangster family. It's a slow burn plot with great suspense and a surprisingly subtle performance from Al Pacino. The acting overall isn't that great, but Brando as usual is, and Pacino is also amazing. They're both notorious for their behind the scenes antics, but it definitely paid off for this. The Green Mile is a 1999 film directed by Frank Darabont starring Tom Hanks and Michael Clarke Duncan. It's about a man put on death row for murder despite seemingly being a gentle giant. From there, it's also a Stephen King story, and it is Stephen King-y, but it's good Stephen King as opposed to bad Stephen King. And Frank Darabont has to be the most underused director in Hollywood. I don't understand what he's doing with his career. So far, he's made 3 of the best movies of all time and created The Walking Dead, and that's basically it, and I don't know why. The directing is great, the writing is good, and of course the acting is great from Tom Hanks and Sam Rockwell, James Cromwell, but on top of all of that, Michael Clarke Duncan steals the show. This is easily the best performance of his career, and as great as everything else in this movie is, he's the best part of this movie. Sunrise is a 1927 film directed by F.W. Murnau starring George O'Brien. The plot follows a man who's seduced by a woman who convinces him to murder his wife in order to be with her. Some view this story as allegorical, while others choose to look at it literally. I'm not sure which it is, but either way, it's great. The writing, the directing, and acting is all great, and I don't mean to demean any of that at all when I say that the camera work is easily the best part about this movie. The cinematography was way ahead of its time. It looks like it came out in the 40s. For context, this movie came out in the 20s. Imagine a film in 1989 coming out that looked like Avatar. That's the comparison here. This film was so outstanding and groundbreaking that the industry didn't catch up for 20 years. That's amazing. Cool Hand Luke is a 1967 film directed by Stuart Rosenberg starring Paul Newman. The plot of this film revolves around a man who's serving his sentence in jail but refuses to conform. He doesn't view himself as a hero, he doesn't view himself as a villain, he just views himself as a man trying to make his way through life. And I think you could debate for hours what this movie's meaning is. There's so much in this movie that you don't normally get from a prison movie. I honestly don't know what the intended meaning of this movie is. I've thought of many ideas, but I don't actually know. But even if this movie didn't have some deeper meaning on a philosophical level, it would just be great just based off the fact that Paul Newman is amazing in this movie. It's got great acting and great dialogue, and the story, whether it has a deeper meaning or not, is fascinating. This movie's just honestly great, and I can't communicate it any better than that. Taxi Driver is a 1976 film directed by Martin Scorsese and starring Robert De Niro. The plot follows a veteran with PTSD struggling to assimilate back into society. It's a biting social and political commentary that may be even more prevalent today than it was when it came out. Told with beautiful but subtle camera work and amazing acting, this movie is just great. Rope is a 1948 film directed by Alfred Hitchcock starring Jimmy Stewart, John Dahl, and Farley Granger. The plot of the film follows 2 men as they attempt to pull off the perfect crime possible: murder in plain sight. They're so sure that they can get away with it that they hide the body in the apartment and then host a dinner party. But one thing that they didn't count on was Jimmy Stewart. As to be expected from Hitchcock, the directing is masterful, and as to be expected from Stewart and co, the acting is great. The movie does employ a gimmick, however, as it's filmed and edited to look like it's all one shot. Hitchcock admitted that it was a failed experiment, but honestly, it was really well done for what they had at the time. It is choppy and it can get distracting at times, but it never takes away from how great this movie is. Mary Poppins is a 1964 film directed by Robert Stevenson, starring Julie Andrews, Dick Van Dyke, and David Tomlinson. The plot follows two children who are visited by a magical nanny who comes to save not only them from their father, but also their father from himself. It had groundbreaking special effects, it had great acting from even the kids, it's so quotable, and every song is iconic. Seriously, every song in this movie is awesome. There's not a bad song in here. In fact, they're all great, and most people know all of them, even if they've never seen the movie, which they have seen the movie because who hasn't? Step in Time, Feed the Birds, Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious all have valid arguments for why they're the most iconic Disney song of all time. Julie Andrews is simply fabulous, and Dick Van Dyke is hilarious, and I know his accent is but come on, he's great. White Christmas is a 1954 film directed by Michael Curtis, starring Bing Crosby and Danny Kaye. The plot of the film follows two soldiers as they exit the war and enter into showbiz. From there, they end up getting involved with two other performers and try to put together a show in Colorado for their old general. Obviously, from the title, you can tell that this is a Christmas movie, and yes, it's very cheesy and it's very Christmassy, but that does not stop it at all from being absolutely fantastic. This movie has great song numbers, it's got great dance numbers, the acting is all great. There's no end to things to love about this movie. It's practically perfect. And you cannot bring up White Christmas without talking about the single greatest cross-dressing scene of all time. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just watch the movie. Steamboat Bill Jr. is a 1928 film directed by and starring Buster Keaton. The plot of the film follows an old-fashioned riverboat captain as his much more modern son comes to work for him. And the situation is only made worse when the son falls in love with the daughter of the father's main rival. And the stunt work in this film is simply iconic, and you've seen stunts from this film whether you know it or not. The most iconic stunt of all time is the man standing as the wall of the house falls around him. That stunt has been done millions of times since to recreate the stunt in this movie. But no recreation was ever nearly as good as the original, and this film is filled with stunt work like that, as are most Buster Keaton films. And on top of that, Buster Keaton's physical comedy and his face work is just simply amazing. Buster Keaton is simply the king of deadpan. How do you do deadpan in a silent film? I don't know, ask him. This isn't just one of the greatest comedies of all time. This is one of the most influential films ever made. Murder, He Says is a 1945 film directed by George Marshall, starring Fred MacMurray. The plot follows a pollster as he accidentally stumbles upon a treasure hunt hosted by a murderous family of hillbillies. The family gets it into their heads that he knows where the treasure is and that he's hiding it from them. However, he doesn't know, so he must escape or die. And as you can tell from this very cheery plot, this is a hilarious comedy. On the surface, it just looks like a murder mystery, and it does have a great plot with twists and turns and treachery, but in reality, it's one of the greatest comedies ever made. It manages to be one of the funniest and most quotable movies of all time while also maintaining a really interesting mystery plot. You could watch it just for the comedy or just for the mystery and still love it either way. It's just that good. Django Unchained is a 2012 film written and directed by Quentin Tarantino. It's starring Jamie Foxx, Christoph Waltz, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Samuel L. Jackson. And whenever people talk about this movie, they always want to talk about DiCaprio because he is amazing in this movie. But he isn't maybe even the best actor. I think Samuel L. Jackson was just as good, if not better, in this movie. And across the board, the acting, as is normal in Tarantino movies, is just awesome. Of course, it's got the Tarantino writing as well, which leads to great witty dialogue and then overblown action sequences that are just so much fun to watch. And then of course DiCaprio's great scene where he cuts his hand. You've all heard about it. It is phenomenal. It's just as good as everybody says it is. It's cheesy and over the top like Tarantino always is, but it's just a great movie that you can't describe any other way than just a lot of fun. Goodfellas is a 1990 film directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Ray Liotta, Robert De Niro, and Joe Pesci. It's also one of the greatest gangster films of all time. If The Godfathers didn't exist, this would be held up as the king of them all. It's quick, it's witty, it's clever, it's dark, and it's got great acting from all of the actors involved. And Joe Pesci especially. He steals every scene that he's in. Shutter Island is a 2010 film directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Mark Ruffalo, and Ben Kingsley. And if you don't know anything about this movie, don't try to find out anything about this movie, just watch it. This movie is just amazing, from the writing to the directing to the acting to the nuance to all the little subtle things. You'll need to watch this movie multiple times to get everything. And that's my favorite kind of movie. I love that, and this is one of the best movies like that in my opinion. And then of course DiCaprio leads this great cast because as we just talked about him in Django Unchained, he's a great actor. He's one of the best actors working today, and he's phenomenal as usual in this. Phantom Carriage is a 1921 film written and directed by and starring Victor Schulstrom. The last person to die each year is chosen by death to be the driver of the Phantom Carriage for that upcoming year. The job of the driver is to collect the spirits of the dead and carry them on to the next life. A man is met by the driver and is forced to look back on his wasted life. This film is simply iconic and has inspired so many great films like The Shining with the scene with the axe. And the story is great too. Think of it as a more macabre Christmas carol. There's so much to love about this film and I can't come up with any reason to hate it. This film is just awesome. Interstellar is a 2014 film written and directed by Christopher Nolan and starring Matthew McConaughey. And it's a sci-fi epic that mixes great and subtle CGI with a phenomenal story. And probably the best thing about this movie is actually its soundtrack. The music is amazing and just... You don't need to watch this movie to listen to this music. Just maybe don't be on the highway listening to it in your car because you might start speeding a little bit. It's such a beautiful movie with the imagery of outer space, with the CGI mixed with the practical effects of the models just melted together perfectly. It's probably the best CGI I've ever seen, and it's used in such a good way in the best looking space movie I've ever seen. Just because it's a beautiful movie doesn't mean it can't also have a great story, and since it was written by Nolan, we know that it does. Seven is a 1995 film directed by David Fincher starring Morgan Freeman, Brad Pitt, Kevin Spacey, and Gwyneth Paltrow. It's a thriller about two detectives trying to track down a murderer who's killing people based off the 7 deadly sins. It's extremely dark and twisted and it's about as close to horror as you can get without actually being horror. I love these kind of villains and I love movies that study the psyche of these kind of villains that almost kind of make sense. They're trying to help in a dark sadistic way and they think that they're actually helping, but in reality, they're not. They're murdering people. That's not helping, but it's so much more interesting when there's a moral dilemma there. I love that. This movie might make your skin crawl, but it is undeniably great. All Quiet on the Western Front is a 1930 film directed by Louis Milestone and starring Lou Ayres. The plot of the film revolves around a group of young men who excitedly sign up to fight in World War I only to be shocked by the horrors of war. This was the first anti-war war movie ever made and was far ahead of its time in its shocking and brutal imagery. There were no movie censors yet and they could show whatever they wanted to, and they did. The movie's very hard to watch in its brutal and raw format, but man is it good. It has iconic imagery and great acting and great writing. This movie is fantastic. Just about every war movie ever since has taken at least a little bit of inspiration from it, and some have taken a lot. Its use of haunting imagery and sound was revolutionary for film, and war movies will never be the same because of it. This movie's a gut punch, and it's great. The Shining is a 1980 film directed by Stanley Kubrick starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. I'm not generally a fan of Kubrick's style. I feel like he's overly perfectionist and overly meticulous. But when it comes to horror, he's absolutely great at it. All the perfectionism, all the nitpicking led to a hollow and haunting environment that was totally necessary to make this movie work. The plot of this film follows a man and his family as he takes over as caretaker of this hotel. They then get cut off from the rest of the world and become completely isolated. This then leads to them slowly slipping into madness, and then from there, it gets pretty Stephen King-y. The movie overall has a haunting and eerie aura to it, and it's stifling, but it's cut through by Nicholson's absolutely stunning performance. This is one of the greatest horror movies of all time, and a great deal of that has to do with Jack Nicholson. He's absolutely fantastic in this. Dr. Mabuse the Gambler is a 1922 film written and directed by Fritz Lang, starring Rudolph Klein-Roga. The plot of the film follows a detective as he tries to unravel the mystery of a crime ring. The crimes range from gambling to counterfeiting all the way to murder, and all the crimes have a strange connection to hypnosis without a single lead. This film would be perfect except for the fact that it's over 4 hours. But aside from some pacing issues and some things that didn't age so well, this film is simply fantastic. The writing is great, the acting is great, and the directing is simply masterful. You can tell why Fritz Lang was the main inspiration for directors like Alfred Hitchcock and Orson Welles. He was a master at this. You could, and many do, consider Fritz Lang to be the first great film director of all time, and this was his first classic. Strangers on a Train is a 1951 film directed by Alfred Hitchcock starring Farley Granger and Robert Walker. The plot of the film follows a man as he meets a complete stranger on a train and accidentally involves himself in a murder case. From there he has to try to free himself from suspicion and blackmail attempts while simultaneously alerting the police to who the real murderer is. And what else can you say about this film that is just classic Hitchcock? I love this movie. Hitchcock was the king of suspense and this movie is just boiling over with suspense the whole time. I love it. I've probably said too much about this already. Just watch it if you haven't. This movie is amazing. A Night at the Opera is a 1935 film directed by Sam Wood and starring the Marx Brothers. And here we go again. There's a plot somewhere in there, but what really matters is that the comedy in this is so good. And at this point they had a bigger budget and so higher production value, and so they're able to do so much more. This movie's just the Marx Brothers at their best, and that's saying a lot. Memento is a 2000 film written and directed by Christopher Nolan starring Guy Pearce, Carrie-Anne Moss, and Joe Pantoliano. The movie follows a man as he tries to hunt down and kill the murderer and rapist of his wife, but due to an injury he is unable to make any new memories. And the movie is told from his perspective without any new memories, and the way they do that is by showing it in reverse order. It's so well directed and so well acted, it's real and raw and original, and there's so much to love about this movie and honestly nothing to hate. Not everyone loves Nolan, but you have to admit that this movie is just great. The Princess Bride is a 1987 film directed by Rob Reiner starring Cary Elwes, Robin Wright, Sean Wallace, Andre the Giant, Mandy Patinkin, Billy Crystal, Fred Savage, Chris Sarandon, the list goes on and on. It's got a great cast. The movie is both a fantasy while also simultaneously parroting fantasies, which is something that only the best parodies can do. It's got fencing, fighting, torture, revenge, giants, monsters, chases, escapes, true love, and miracles. And on top of that, it's just one of the best movies to quote of all time. I'm very critical of fencing and sword fighting in movies because I actually used to fence, and most of the stuff we get in movies is utterly stupid. But the fencing in this movie is actually legitimately good. For the most part, there's some cheesy fun moments too. It's got great characters that you love and great memorable moments throughout the movie. This is just a great movie, which ultimately is what brings us here together today. Mr. Nobody is a 2009 film written and directed by Jaco van der Merwe starring Jared Leto, and it is quite possibly the most underrated film of all time. You may have never even heard of it. The movie takes place in the near future where medicine has advanced to the point that nobody has to die of natural causes anymore, and Jared Leto plays the last man that will die of natural causes due to his insistence that he doesn't want the treatment. He's very old now and is near to death and has become somewhat of a celebrity because of it. He's refused to tell his story up until this point, but is now finally willing to tell a reporter his whole life story. But none of it really matches up and it's kind of confusing, and that's all I can say because from there we get into spoilers. This movie is great if you love deep psychological sci-fi, and it's also great if you just love romance. And it's a very original idea, the writing is phenomenal, it's so much fun to look at, it's very artistic and indie feeling. I love it, and I just think it's a crime that not more people know what it is. Platoon is a 1986 film written and directed by Oliver Stone, starring Charlie Sheen, Tom Berenger, and Willem Dafoe. This movie follows a young soldier in Vietnam as he realizes the horror of war and that he might not actually be on the right side of things. He's surrounded by evil as even his own friends turn against each other and they start killing each other. It's a hard movie to watch and it's really heartbreaking in a lot of ways. But this is such a great movie with amazing performances by Willem Dafoe, who's one of the greatest character actors of all time, and Charlie Sheen, who surprisingly proved that he was cast in this movie for more than just because his dad was in another famous Vietnam movie. People forget he was actually a legitimate actor before Tiger Blood infusion. All jokes aside, this is one of the best Vietnam War movies of all time, and just one of the best war movies of all time, and one of just the best movies, period, of all time. This movie is great. Scarface is a 1983 film directed by Brian De Palma starring Al Pacino and Michelle Pfeiffer. And this movie was so good and so famous that Al Pacino got stuck playing this character for his entire career since. Oh well. The plot follows a gangster and his rise to power and eventual overtaking of the drug cartel. He then succumbs to his greed and his life falls apart, and then we go on from there. And why I love this movie so much is it perfectly shows the absolute insanity that comes along with power and greed. Pacino's character was never an angel in this film, but he started out as somewhat likable and actually relatable. By the end of this film, he's unrecognizable, and it's honestly a tragedy. Like I said, not the most subtle movie, but that aside, this movie has great acting, good directing, good writing, and it's just a lot of fun to watch. Birdman is a 2014 film written and directed by Alejandro Inarritu, and it's starring Michael Keaton, Zach Galifianakis, Ed Norton, and Emma Stone. Like Black Swan, this is a psychological thriller about the mental toll it takes to be in this kind of industry. Being in the spotlight, being under this pressure from the work environment, it's all so much. But this is told from the perspective of Michael Keaton playing a has-been, somebody who was a great character for a long time but no longer has that popularity. And he's fighting desperately to get that back, and this movie is great for the story, it's great for the acting, but man, the visuals in this movie, again, are amazing. This movie is filmed and edited for the most part to look like one continuous shot. This trick had been used in films before like Rope, but this was the best version of it to date. It was practically seamless, it looked great. And on top of that, the directing itself is just so smooth and beautiful and artistic, and I love it. The acting as a whole is great, but this is also my favorite Ed Norton performance of his career, and might be my favorite Michael Keaton performance of his career as well. This whole movie is just so good. I love every second of it. It is so original, so special, and such just a great movie. The Third Man is a 1949 film directed by Carol Reed, starring Joseph Cotton and Alida Valli. A novelist travels to Vienna to visit an old friend, only to find himself caught up in the middle of a murder mystery of that same friend. But not everything seems to be as simple as they say it is. From the police to the black market to dirty politics, everything seems just a bit off. And this story is just masterfully written. I absolutely adored this plot. I love movies that make me think, and I love even more movies that are smarter than I am, and this movie had me scratching my head for a good portion of it. The directing is absolutely amazing. I love the Dutch angles and all the camera work in this, and then the music is just so good and so unique. This movie very easily could have been basic and boring, but they did everything they could to make it unique and great, new and interesting. This movie is just awesome. The Truman Show is a 1998 film directed by Peter Weir, starring Jim Carrey and Ed Harris. The plot centers around a man who's the star of a reality TV show without being aware of it. His whole life is a lie. He lives in a dome and he's surrounded by actors and set pieces rather than real people in a real town. For the first time to a mainstream audience, Jim Carrey showcased his dramatic abilities while sprinkling in a little bit of comedy. But on top of the good acting in this movie, it's also a very original idea that's very creative, very interesting, and also a nice little commentary. This movie just might be the most original of the 1990s and one of the most original movies ever made. The Stranger is a 1946 film directed by Orson Welles, starring Orson Welles and Edward G. Robinson. The plot follows an investigator from the War Crimes Commission as he travels to find an infamous Nazi hiding out in a small town in Connecticut. And I just absolutely love the battle of wits between Orson Welles and Edward G. Robinson's characters in this. Both characters are so brilliant in this, and you hate seeing one of them have to lose. Orson Welles' performance is fantastic, and his character is extremely underrated. He's one of my favorite villains of all time. This movie is amazing and practically flawless. Whiplash is a 2014 film written and directed by Damien Chazelle, starring Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons. And J.K. Simmons might as well win Actor of the Decade award just for this film because oh my god, is he good. So the plot of this movie is fairly simple. Miles Teller plays a drummer trying to make this prestigious group of jazz players. This group is led by J.K. Simmons, who's very well known and prestigious in his field, but he's also kind of crazy. And it leads to so much great drama, so much great acting. The writing in this movie is also phenomenal, but it's all overshadowed by the fact that J.K. Simmons delivers the performance of his life in this film. Now, I like J.K. Simmons, but I'm not normally putting him in a top 10 list for best actors of all time or anything. But this performance by J.K. Simmons is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, acting performances of all time. I'm not exaggerating that at all. He's just phenomenal in this movie, and I can't find a better way to say it than that. He's just amazing. You don't need to like drumming, you don't need to like jazz music. This movie will make you love and at least kind of understand both. And on top of all of that, it will just make you understand how great this movie is. It is so good. The Exorcist is a 1973 film directed by William Friedkin, starring Jason Miller, Lee J. Cobb, and Linda Blair. The plot follows a little girl as she gets possessed by a demon and then the ensuing exorcism. It had groundbreaking special effects, horrific imagery, and outstanding acting from the entire cast, but especially Blair. This movie is utterly chilling and absolutely disgusting, and I never want to see it again. I don't want to own it. I don't even want the DVD in my bedroom, and that's probably the best praise you can give to a horror movie. Her is a 2013 film written and directed by Spike Jonze, starring Joaquin Phoenix, Scarlett Johansson, and Amy Adams. And I cannot say a bad thing about this movie. It is perfect. This movie follows a man who's very depressed because he's in a separation leading to an eventual divorce. The man ends up getting a new operating system voiced by Scarlett Johansson, who delivers the performance of her lifetime. And this movie is so emotionally intelligent. Believe me, if you're going through a breakup, don't watch it, or maybe you should watch it. Regardless, you're gonna cry. Joaquin Phoenix is another great actor, and Scarlett Johansson is a phenomenal actress who's been underrated for years and is finally getting recognition, but this movie isn't necessarily getting that recognition, whereas this is probably the best performance of her career. This movie may have actually fallen apart without Scarlett Johansson's acting. She is the glue that holds this movie together. It's phenomenally acted, very well written, and the directing is so good that you almost don't notice that it's a movie. It just feels like a real life event, and that's the best thing you can say about a movie, is that it feels real. And this is one of the realest movies I've ever seen, even if it is a futuristic sci-fi romance. It is amazing, it's phenomenal, and you should definitely check it out if you haven't seen it or even heard of it yet. Young Frankenstein is a 1974 film written and directed by Mel Brooks, starring Gene Wilder, Marty Feldman, Madeline Kahn, and Peter Boyle. And as you can expect from Mel Brooks, this movie is absolutely hilarious. The plot follows Frederick Frankenstein and his assistant Igor as they follow in his grandfather's footsteps by creating a life from nothing, by taking a dead body and making it live again. And this movie is absolutely amazing in every way. Mel Brooks is the greatest comedy director of all time and essentially invented the parody. Gene Wilder is the king of deadpan. Madeline Kahn was the funniest woman to ever live, and Marty Feldman just steals and eats every scene he's in, and I absolutely love this guy. And that's leaving out the rest of the cast, and they're all great and funny too. Don't believe me that Mel Brooks is amazing? He put out this movie the same year that he put out Blazing Saddles. That's crazy. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a 1975 film directed by Milos Forman, starring Jack Nicholson and Louise Fletcher. The plot follows a criminal who manages to get himself moved to an insane asylum to avoid a harsher sentence. Once there, however, he notices how mistreated the patients are and rebels to try to get them a better life. This honestly might be my favorite Jack Nicholson performance of his career. He's always good, but this is a much more subtle, nuanced character than we're used to seeing from him. I can honestly say that this movie's practically perfect in every way. It's just really great. Now Work is a 1976 film directed by Sidney Lumet, starring Faye Dunaway and Peter Finch. The plot follows a news network and its executives as they decide to exploit the well-being of one of their former employees. After having an on-air mental breakdown, their news anchor becomes one of the most talked about people in the media. Rather than trying to help him, they give him his own show and let him rant and rave until he literally passes out. At any moment, he could be seconds away from killing himself, but they don't care because he boosts their ratings. It's been a saying for a long time that you can't believe everything you read in the news, but this really showed how dark and corrupt that world is. Every media outlet has an agenda, whether it's immediately evident or not. They're all just trying to get viewers, they're all just trying to get ratings, they're all just trying to get money. It's a business. This is a commentary that was prevalent then, now, and always will be. It's a great message, it's a great cast, it's great directing, great writing. This movie is just practically flawless, and I love it even though it's kind of depressing. Arsenic and Old Lace is a 1944 film directed by Frank Capra and starring Cary Grant. The plot of the film revolves around a man who's shocked to find that his relatives are homicidal maniacs and that insanity runs in the family. This is the original dark comedy, and oh my god, is it funny. This movie was so far ahead of its time in what it was willing to do for a joke, and I'm not complaining about that in the least. The writing is so good, the directing is so good, all the acting is great, every single character in this movie is so much fun to watch. Even if they're not doing anything, you just enjoy watching them in the background. Everyone is just phenomenal. This movie is absolutely absurd and it's balls to the walls fun, and man, I enjoy it. Modern Times is a 1936 film written, produced, and yes, it's a Chaplin film. He did everything. The plot of the film follows the tramp as he attempts to adapt to the ever-changing modern world. Chaplin often got sentimental in his comedies, but this was the first time that he got political. In the 1930s, the world was changing rapidly, and Chaplin had a lot to say about that. And this movie is great for it. It is both hilarious and important. It was much like the sci-fi movies of the 20s while still remaining Chaplin's unique brand of comedy. It was the perfect balance of both and was just great for it. Chaplin had control over every single second of every single one of his movies, and this was him in the middle of his prime. Mr. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is a 1939 film directed by Frank Capra starring Jimmy Stewart. The plot of this film follows a man who's elected as a political stooge only to find out that the politicians surrounding him are not so innocent. He might be young and naive, but he's now an elected official, so he uses his power to combat against the corruption that surrounds him. And in like all Jimmy Stewart films, he owns every scene he's in, and I absolutely adore him and his personality. It's that ultimate good versus evil story that we can all get behind, believing that there is some good in us if we can just remember it and find it. And if there's anyone that can make me believe in humanity, it's Jimmy Stewart. Gone with the Wind is a 1939 film directed by Victor Fleming starring Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable. The plot of the film revolves around the romance between a manipulative woman and a roguish man during the American Civil War, and it's ultimately a character study of the elitists at that time. You either had to change and adapt to the times or be left behind. And yes, Victor Fleming directed The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind in the same year. The two most visually stunning movies of the decade came out the same year and were directed by the same man. The acting is amazing, the writing is amazing, and like I said, it's one of the most beautiful movies ever made. The Circus is a 1928 film, and like with all Charlie Chaplin films, he not only starred in, wrote, and directed it, he also personally composed the soundtrack, personally edited, and produced it. The plot of the film follows the tramp as he accidentally joins the circus and then finds himself as the head clown and star of the show. And as is to be expected from a Charlie Chaplin comedy, the comedy is absolutely great. The physical comedy is out of this world, and the comedic timing is possibly the best I've ever seen in any movie ever. And you can't say that Chaplin wasn't committed to a good performance. He locked himself in a cage with a lion. That's commitment. It's a simple but fun plot with, of course, great acting, writing, and directing from Charlie Chaplin. Saving Private Ryan is a 1998 film directed by Steven Spielberg starring Tom Hanks and Matt Damon. It is also one of the most haunting and hard to watch war movies of all time. It's brutal, it's heart-wrenching, but it's absolutely amazing. Tom Hanks does carry most of the dramatic and emotional moments on this movie on his own, but every other actor and character comes through when they need to. This movie is always brought up when talking about the best war movies of all time, and rightfully so. This just might be the best World War II movie of all time. Pulp Fiction is a 1994 film written and directed by Quentin Tarantino, starring Samuel L. Jackson, John Travolta, Uma Thurman, and Bruce Willis. And it is one of the best movies ever made that happens to be about nothing. Or maybe about everything. Nobody really knows. And this was the moment that people realized who Tarantino actually was. Because it's quite possible that this movie doesn't have a meaning. I think it does, but even if it didn't, it would be one of the most entertaining movies ever made in the most Quentin Tarantino kind of way. It's got great action, over-the-top violence, witty humor, fast dialogue, just random dance moments, and just a lot of fun to watch. This movie is exactly what the title says it should be, Pulp Fiction. It's absolute madness, and I love it. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a 1920 film directed by Robert Vine starring Werner Krauss. The plot of the film follows a depraved doctor who hypnotizes people to murder in their sleep. This film is credited as the first horror movie of all time, and it's still great to this day. The imagery is absolutely outstanding and macabre and dark and sinister, and I love it so much. Everything about this movie is just cool and creepy in all the right ways. It's got great acting, great writing, great dark creepy imagery, and a great twist ending. What more could you want from a film? This wasn't just the first horror movie made. It's one of the greatest horror movies ever made. Harvey is a 1950 film directed by Henry Koster and starring Jimmy Stewart. The plot of the film revolves around a delusional man who believes that he has an imaginary friend of a 6-foot-tall rabbit. His relatives are trying to get him committed to an insane asylum while he's just trying to live his life blissfully ignorant. And ultimately, this movie just asks the question, is it better to be oh so clever or oh so pleasant? Is there anything actually wrong with being a little bit off if you're a really good person and debatably the best person in the town? Jimmy Stewart brings so much character to this role that nobody else could. He takes this kind of silly premise and elevates it to something deep and profound on a philosophical level. And just like the rest of his movies, no matter how good they are, Jimmy Stewart is always the best part about it. Inglourious Basterds is a 2009 film written and directed by Quentin Tarantino and starring Brad Pitt, Christoph Waltz, Melanie Laurent, Diane Kruger, Eli Roth, and Michael Fassbender, as well as many more. This is just a great cast. And to me, this is Tarantino at his best. It's Tarantino's version of a World War II epic, and it's just so much fun while also not letting Tarantino's great visual style overshadow the actual plot of this movie. And the opening scene of this film is actually my favorite Tarantino directed scene ever, and one of the best scenes ever made. The tension builds so perfectly in all the right moments in this film, and the acting is so well done, and the writing is so good, as Tarantino always is. Brad Pitt is as great as he always is, and Christoph Waltz in this is one of the greatest villains of all time. I absolutely adore his character. He's clever, he's snarky, he's snood, he's very German, and he's just a lot of fun to hate. The Dark Knight is a 2008 film written and directed by Christopher Nolan, starring Christian Bale, Heath Ledger, Michael Caine, Maggie Gyllenhaal, Aaron Eckhart, and many more. This movie also has a great cast. And The Dark Knight did for comic book movies what The Lord of the Rings did for fantasy movies, making it actually cool to enjoy comic book movies. It took it from being cheesy and cliche and over the top to actually being grounded in semi-reality, being fun, and also really cool. And while trying to figure out where to rank this exactly on the list, it was neck and neck with Inglourious Basterds. It was ultimately decided by one thing, that being the villain. And I had just mentioned that Christoph Waltz is one of the greatest villains of all time, but Heath Ledger's Joker is even better. It's certainly debatable, but it's not reaching at all to claim that Heath Ledger's Joker is the greatest villain that cinema has ever seen. This movie has Christian Bale and Gary Oldman and Michael Caine and all of these great actors in it, and you don't want to see them for 1 second, because every moment that Heath Ledger's Joker is not on the screen, you want him to be. And that's not because the rest of the movie's bad. The movie's great. He's just that good. The Godfather Part 2 is a 1974 film directed by Francis Ford Coppola, starring Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. And it's impossible to completely replace Marlon Brando, but Robert De Niro did a pretty darn good job trying. He's able to pull off a really subtle impression of Brando without being overbearing. It never becomes a caricature, but you know that he's the same guy as the other guy. And it's just really well done. It's a really hard thing to do in acting, and he pulls it off brilliantly. This film serves as a sequel and a prequel simultaneously. It gives us the early life of Vito Corleone while also giving us the later life of Michael Corleone. This draws parallels between the two story arcs and helps compare and contrast the rise and fall of both of these godfathers. And this movie is just great. It improves on the first one in every way. On the surface, it wouldn't seem that way, since Brando is the best thing about the first one and doesn't return for this one, but just everything's better in this one. The overall acting is better, the writing is better, the dialogue's better, the pacing's better, the action is definitely better. This is just the perfect sequel, and it's an amazing movie. You almost don't need the first one because of this one. But it's made even better by the context of the first one. This movie is just amazing. Just amazing. Apocalypse Now is a 1979 film directed by Francis Ford Coppola, starring Martin Sheen and Marlon Brando. We get it, Frankie. You had a good decade, alright, we get it. This film serves as an allegory about the Vietnam War and war in general and just the state of humanity. It speaks on how war strips away our humanity and how the deeper in and the farther we go, the less we actually resemble humans. It's full of dark imagery, superb writing, and absolutely great acting. Not many people could put up with Marlon Brando, but we're very lucky Francis Ford Coppola could. Dial M for Murder is a 1954 film directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Ray Millard and Grace Kelly. This plot revolves around murder and being framed for murder. Hitchcock firmly believed that in order to create suspense with an audience, you had to make them aware of something that the characters in the movie were not made aware of. And this movie is a testament to that belief. From the beginning of the movie, you know the mystery, you know the bad guy, you know the crime, but you're following along with the detectives and the criminal as they try to catch and evade each other. This creates one of the best and most interesting cat and mouse plots ever put to screen. Dr. Strangelove is a 1964 film directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring Peter Sellers and George C. Scott, and it very well might just be the best dark comedy ever made. The plot follows the chaos that ensues after an insane general issues a seemingly unstoppable nuclear strike. The American and Russian leaders need to work together in order to prevent all that war, but they're too immature and stubborn to work together. It's a great dark comedy and political commentary that takes the subject of war and shrinks it down to a pissing contest, or more accurately, a pie throwing contest. It's got clever writing and great acting from both Sellers and Scott, and honestly, really good directing from Kubrick. Kubrick actually only told some actors that was a comedy and told others that was a drama in order to get the right performance out of all of them. It was a clever trick, and harmless by Kubrick standards. Inception is a 2010 film written and directed by Christopher Nolan. It's got his best cast of all time with Leonardo DiCaprio, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Tom Hardy, Marion Cotillard, Cillian Murphy, Michael Caine, the list goes on and on and on. It's an intelligent movie, but it's not hard to follow. It's got great acting, great directing, and great writing, a very interesting and original story, and of course that whole dream within a dream within a dream thing has shaped pop culture. The word Inception doesn't even mean what people think it means anymore. It's got great acting with great chemistry between DiCaprio and Cotillard, Hardy and Gordon-Levitt, and just everybody in general. I can't possibly say every great thing about this movie in this video. I don't have enough time, but you can't talk about Inception without talking about the ending, because the ending of Inception is one of the most iconic endings to a film of all time, and certainly the most iconic moment of the 2010s. Last Year at Marienbad is a 1961 film directed by Elaine Reyne, starring Delphine Seyrig and Giorgio Albertazzi. I hope that's remotely close. The plot of this film follows a man as he follows a woman at this resort in Marienbad as he tries to convince her that they've not only met before, but are having an affair. However, she doesn't remember him and so doesn't believe him, but he keeps on persisting. And that's all I can tell you about this plot because woo, this one's fun. If you like movies that take multiple viewings to entirely understand, you're gonna love this. This is one of the best of those of all time. This movie is great. Not to mention the cinematography and the acting and the atmosphere and the imagery. It's all so great. It's very artistic, it's very French, it's very unique, and I love this movie. I'm upset that I've only just heard of it and seen it for the first time this year. This is one of the best movies ever made. I wish I could say more, but I'm afraid that I'd give something away by accident. This movie's just awesome. Please go see it. Eternal Sunshine is a 2004 film directed by Michel Gondry, starring Jim Carrey, Kate Winslet. It's one of the most raw and real movies I've ever watched. The acting is brilliant, the writing is so real. It just feels like an actual relationship, and you can't watch it and not relate to it in some way. This plot is about a man who's found that his lover has erased him from her memory through this process that a company provides. So he decides that since she did it, that he needs to do it too so he can go on living without her. But during the process, he finds out that he doesn't want it anymore and tries to hold on to the memories as they're being erased one by one. Jim Carrey is not just simply a funny-faced slapstick comedian. He's a dramatic powerhouse, and he shows it off in this movie. Kate Winslet as well is phenomenal. Everybody is, and this movie is just ultimately perfect in almost every way. Filled with great acting, great writing, and also great imagery, this is just one of the best movies I've ever seen. The Silence of the Lambs is a 1991 film directed by Jonathan Demme, starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. And it just so happens to be one of the greatest horror movies of all time, starring one of the greatest horror villains of all time. Don't get me wrong, Jodie Foster is great in this movie, but Hannibal Lecter is just one of those characters that you want to see every second of the film. Anthony Hopkins is so good and so believable and so sinister, and the dialogue is so well written that just every moment he's on screen, you adore him in the worst way. And there's no real reason that you should be scared of him. He's just an old man in a jail cell for most of the movie. But you can just tell from the way that he holds himself that he's terrifying. But you can also honestly tell it from the way that the characters around him hold themselves too, so give them credit too. It's a Chaplin film. You know the drill. He did everything. The plot of the film follows the tramp who falls in love with a blind flower girl. Despite having nothing of his own, he does his best to take care of her because she's even less fortunate than he is. And in traditional Chaplin fashion, it's very sweet and very sad, but also very funny and very uplifting. In each one of his movies, he makes you laugh and cry, but this might be the best balance of both in any of his movies. Not only was he the funniest comedian and director of the 1930s, but he brought a level of professionalism and perfectionism that no other comedian had. Comedy wasn't supposed to make you cry that way. Comedy wasn't supposed to make you feel that way. Comedy wasn't supposed to teach you something like that, but he did all of that. He fit all of those things all into one movie with amazing directing, amazing writing, and amazing acting, and amazing editing that he all did by himself. And each one of his movies are amazing, and this movie's just literal perfection. Schindler's List is a 1993 film directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Liam Neeson, Ralph Fiennes, and Ben Kingsley. I may be known to have given Spielberg grief in the past. In recent history, he's been pretty hit or miss, but in the 90s, he could do no wrong. And that's shown best by the fact that this movie came out the same year as Jurassic Park, which didn't make the list, but very easily could have. This is another flawless film, and flawless films are honestly kind of hard to talk about because you just go, yeah, the whole thing's great. This is just another World War II movie like Saving Private Ryan that pulls at your heartstrings like only traditional Spielberg can. It's definitely a tough movie to get through with the subject matter, but it's definitely worth the watch whenever you can. Sherlock Jr. is a 1924 film written and directed by Buster Keaton and starring Buster Keaton. The plot of the film follows a projectionist who falls asleep and dreams of being a great detective like Sherlock Holmes. It has trippy visuals with outstanding editing and groundbreaking special effects that are simply breathtaking. This movie came out almost 100 years ago and it's still crazy impressive. They did all of it without CGI, they just had to edit it normally. And the stunt work, as usual with Buster Keaton, is absolutely mind-blowing. Why did he do this? How did he do it? I don't know, but it's absolutely amazing. This is one of the most visually stunning and captivating movies ever made, and it came out in the 20s. That's ridiculous. The Prestige is a 2006 film written and directed by Christopher Nolan, starring Hugh Jackman, Christian Bale, Scarlett Johansson, Michael Caine, Andy Serkis, and David Bowie. This movie was so amazing that it made people forget about The Illusionist, which I just talked about a few movies ago on this list. Because the two movies shared a couple of similar plot points, they were deemed copycat films, and so both were forgotten about a little bit because of that. But The Prestige has risen back up as one of the greatest movies of all time, and I'd go out as far as to say that's the best movie to come out since the year 2000. And I've talked about a lot of really good actors so far on these lists, like DiCaprio and J.K. Simmons and actors like that, but Christian Bale is the best actor working today in my opinion, and this is one of his best roles. He's absolutely phenomenal in this movie, and so is everyone. Hugh Jackman is really good, Scarlett Johansson is really good, the whole cast is really good, and the plot is so intense and so creative and so original that it went over my head the first time I saw it, and I absolutely hated it. Then the second time I saw it, I went, oh, this is pretty good. The third time I saw it, I said, wait, this is really good. The fourth time I saw it, I said, this movie's great, and ever since, I haven't looked back. This movie is amazing. The Shawshank Redemption is a 1994 film directed by Frank Darabont starring Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman. And Frank Darabont really did just make two of the greatest movies of the 90s and dip, didn't he? I know I mentioned some of the other projects he's done, but he really just hasn't done much since the 90s, and he owned the 90s. Where's he been? That out of the way, The Shawshank Redemption is notorious for one of the biggest plot holes in one of the supposed greatest movies of all time. Now, I want to go on record as saying that The Shawshank Redemption doesn't have a plot hole, and that the hole that is in this movie is perfectly covered how it is. Now, it doesn't fully explain how that plot hole is covered exactly, but it doesn't need to because it doesn't show that it's not covered either. And if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And on top of that, the acting in this movie is just phenomenal across the board, and this also might just be Morgan Freeman's best performance of his career. Morgan Freeman is always good. It doesn't matter what acting job he takes in whatever crappy movie he's in, he's always good. But in this movie, he is amazing in an amazing movie. And I think it can go without saying, but I'm gonna say it anyway, that The Shawshank Redemption is the greatest prison movie of all time. It's inspired every prison movie to come out after it. When you think prison movies or you think Prison Break, you think Shawshank Redemption, whether you know it or not. Monty Python the Holy Grail is a 1975 film written and directed by Monty Python and starring Monty Python. Seriously, if you don't know who's in Monty Python, look him up. The plot of this film centers around a prince from Chester who has a particular interest in lunch. The nemesis is a prince who smells like cheese. Wait, this isn't the right plot. Does the plot matter? It's Monty Python. Monty Python is the greatest collection of comedic minds ever made, and Monty Python and the Holy Grail is their greatest work. This results in possibly the greatest comedy ever made. It's hilarious, it's satirical, it's quick-witted, it's just amazing, and I can't get enough of it. The 1970s in general was a very angsty and politically charged time, so it makes sense that such a great comedy would come at such a hard time. It's extremely smart, it's extremely quotable, and it's even more famous than most of the things that it was satirizing. Casablanca is a 1942 film directed by Michael Curtiz starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. The plot of the film revolves around a man in the midst of a love triangle and World War II political drama as he tries to decide whether or not to help his ex-lover and her fugitive husband escape from French Morocco. This might not sound like a plot that you're interested in, but I promise you if you like film, you'll love this movie. So it doesn't even matter what the movie's about, everything is just so beautiful to look at. From the acting to the writing to the directing to the camera work to just everything is just perfectly done. Humphrey Bogart is absolutely fantastic in this role and Ingrid Bergman is just as good. The characters feel real and the dialogue is extremely sharp and very quotable and everything about this movie is just flawless. Good Will Hunting is a 1997 film directed by Gus Van Sant starring Robin Williams and Matt Damon. And if you're a sucker for emotional powerhouse moments, or if you have tendencies to cry during movies, you might need a break in between viewings of this film. This movie is like a punch to the gut, but it doesn't stop. It hits you over and over and over again with amazing emotional moments throughout this film, mainly helmed by Robin Williams in one of the best acting performances of all time, but also Matt Damon does hold his own against Williams. I consider Robin Williams one of the best actors of all time, and I consider this his best acting performance of all time. And throughout this movie, we have Robin Williams showing off his great acting ability with some of the best monologues and ad-libbing we've ever seen. But there's one scene in particular where, if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. Matt Damon holds his own against Robin Williams in one of the best scenes ever put to screen. I can't understand why anybody would ever dislike this movie. It's simply amazing. Anatomy of a Murder is a 1959 film directed by Otto Preminger and starring Jimmy Stewart. The plot of the film follows an attorney who takes the case of a defendant pleading temporary insanity in the murder of his wife's rapist. And this has to be the most accurate courtroom drama I've ever seen. It's absolutely fantastically written. You don't know if the defendant is lying or not. You don't know if the witnesses are lying or not. You don't know what the truth is. You're just looking at it from the point of justice and the law. And that's great. This movie is so well written. It's masterfully written. And the back and forths between Jimmy Stewart and George C. Scott are so good. I could watch them argue for days. 12 Angry Men is a 1957 film directed by Sidney Lumet, starring Henry Fonda and Lee J. Cobb. The plot of the film revolves around a jury as they attempt to reconsider the seemingly obvious evidence put before them. And much like Anatomy of a Murder, this film never explicitly tells you what the truth is. Both of these films really respect their audiences and allow them to come to their own conclusions, and that's amazing. The majority of this movie is confined to one small room and 12 characters, but you never get bored because the acting and the dialogue is just that good. The dialogue, the characters, the growth, the development, everything about this movie is just perfect in every way. The Gold Rush is a 1925 film written and directed by Charlie Chaplin and starring Charlie Chaplin. The plot of the film follows the tramp as he travels north in search of gold. Rather than gold, however, he keeps finding trouble. This film just might be the most influential comedy of all time. You can see its impact on dozens of movies simply by the fact that they're just watching it in the background. That's how influential it is. It's also just iconic in how many times people have paid homage to it in their own movies in other ways. It's got memorable jokes, it's got memorable imagery, it's got great special effects, it's got great acting, and of course Charlie Chaplin is just awesome at everything else too. This is the funniest comedy he ever made and the most influential comedy he ever made. This movie is just fantastic. I can't think of a single flaw in this movie, and that's unheard of in comedy. There's always going to be one or two jokes that don't land, or the story's just not that interesting, or it falls apart about halfway through. Not in this. Every joke lands perfectly. All of the comedy is amazing, and the story's great. Charlie Chaplin is amazing in every role he filled in this movie, whether it was actor, director, writer, producer, editor, everything he did. This movie was fantastic. Emma is a 1931 film written and directed by Fritz Lang, starring Otto Wernicke and Peter Lorre. When the police are unable to catch a murderer with an affinity for young girls, the rest of the criminals join the manhunt. Not only is this a great horror, thriller, action movie, it's also a biting social and political commentary. Fritz Lang's writing and directing is absolutely stupendous, and this is his best movie ever made. Lang was the biggest inspiration for directors like Orson Welles and Alfred Hitchcock, and you understand why while watching this. It's absolutely amazing. This movie is chilling and creepy, but also exciting and even funny at times, and also just amazing to watch. I can't come up with a single complaint about this movie. It is fantastic from start to finish. Across the board, the acting is great, but Peter Lorre specifically delivers the performance of his lifetime in this role. He was made to do this role. He does it perfectly. I could rant for hours and hours about how cool and how unique and how amazing this movie was. Psycho is a 1960 film directed by Alfred Hitchcock starring Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins. This movie strays slightly from the murder, mystery, thriller formula that we're so used to from Hitchcock and wanders over into horror. And the result was so iconic that this film is credited as the originator of the slasher genre. This film is amazing from the writing to the directing to the acting. Everything about this movie is flawless. It has one of the most iconic endings of all time, some of the greatest quotes of all time, and the pinnacle of monologues in horror history, if you ask me. This was Hitchcock's last great masterpiece and his greatest film of all time, in my opinion. In fact, many would argue that this is the greatest film of all time. The The Great Dictator is a 1940 film written and directed, produced, starring everything Charlie Chaplin. He did everything. The plot of the film is twofold as it follows a Jewish barber attempting to survive in the ghetto while simultaneously following the dictator about his everyday life. It might sound odd to say that Chaplin was revolutionary for saying that Hitler was bad, but keep in mind that this movie came out the same year that Hitler was named Time's Man of the Year. Think about that. This movie was an extreme risk on multiple fronts for Chaplin. Not only the political edge to it, but this was also the first time that he spoke in one of his films. He had never made a sound film before, and this was a whole new territory for him. But it paid off in a big way, as this is one of the greatest films ever made. It's extremely hilarious, but it's also poignant and slow and intellectual when it needs to be. This movie had a lot to say, and it wasn't afraid to say it, and it said it all beautifully. Sometimes it was said with pictures like Chaplin was used to, but sometimes it was said with the most eloquent monologue ever put to film. Chaplin was already a great comedian and comedy director, but this one solidified him as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, auteurs of all time. It's a Wonderful Life is a 1946 film directed by Frank Capra, starring Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed. The plot of the film follows a man who loses everything and so wishes that he had never been born. He is then visited by an angel who shows him what the world would look like if his wish was granted. And this is simply the most iconic story ever told. How many times has this been redone, remade, parodied? In some form or another, we get this movie remade and repackaged for us practically every year. Frank Capra is one of the greatest directors of all time, and of course, Jimmy Stewart steals the show in every single shot, every scene, every moment. He's amazing. His character holds so much weight and sorrow throughout the movie. You can just see it on his face, in his eyes, and he holds it so well and so authentically. This movie is so good and so powerful and so important. It's often regulated as simply a Christmas movie, but it doesn't need to be. You can watch this at any time. It's always just as good. This isn't just the greatest Christmas movie ever. It's debatably the greatest movie ever made. In fact, I would say it was the greatest movie of all time, if not for the one other movie on this list. I mean, you kind of had to see it coming a little bit. Citizen Kane is a 1941 film written, directed, and starring Orson Welles. Following the death of publishing tycoon Charles Foster Kane, reporters scramble to uncover the meaning of his final utterance, Rosebud. Through interviews and flashbacks, we begin to unravel his whole life story. Every little piece helping us to understand who this mysterious Mr. Kane was, and how he went from the seemingly innocent young man to the tyrant that he later became. This movie takes place over an entire lifetime, so you have these same actors playing these characters for their entire life. You have Orson Welles playing Kane at 20 years old, 40, 60, and 80, and that goes for the whole cast. The makeup and the acting is so good and genuine that it's better than any of the CGI garbage we get today. The way that they move, the way that they sound, the way that they act and look, it all just feels real and you believe it every second. Secondly, the camera work is absolutely stunning and brilliant to look at. The acting is all phenomenal. The writing and dialogue is all great. Every single thing that could be great in this movie is. This movie is a 10 out of 10. It's a 100 out of 100. This movie is flawless in every way. There's nothing to critique. There's nothing to point out. It's all just brilliant and amazing. And if you haven't seen this movie, you need to. It is the best movie ever made. If there was a flaw, I would point it out to you guys. I would say it. I'd be honest. I cannot come up with one for this movie. It is flawless. So that's my list. I hope you guys liked it and I hope you agreed with me. I know you didn't because making these lists is impossible. There's always something to disagree with on just a little bit. So if you did disagree with me, please don't hate me. Just leave it in the comments below your list and your favorite movie and we can talk about it there. Also, please like and share. It does help me out a lot. And if you're new here, please subscribe. Thanks guys. Bye.